Hello, and welcome to Dissecting Philosophy with Dr McDonald. In this episode, I'll be reading and discussing the sections The Cry of Distress and Conversation with the Kings in Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra. So let's get started. The Cry of Distress. The following day, Zarathustra was again sitting upon the stone before his cave, while the animals were roving about in the world outside, fetching fresh food, and fresh honey too. For Zarathustra had consumed and squandered the old honey to the last drop. But as he was sitting there with a stick in his hand, tracing the shadow of his figure in the ground, thinking, and truly, not about himself and his shadow, all at once he started back in alarm, for he saw another shadow besides his own. And, as he quickly rose and looked around, behold, there stood beside him the prophet, the same that had once eaten and drunk at his table, the prophet of the great weariness, who taught, "It is all one, nothing is worthwhile, the world is without meaning, knowledge chokes." But his face had changed in the interim, and when Zarathustra looked into the prophet's eyes, his heart was again startled. So many evil prophecies and ashen lightning flashes passed his face. The prophet, who had perceived what was going on in Zarathustra's soul, wiped his hand over his face, as if he wanted to wipe it away. Zarathustra did the same, and when each had silently composed and reassured himself, they shook hands as a sign that they wanted to recognize one another. "Welcome to you," said Zarathustra, "you prophet of the great weariness. Not in vain shall you once have been guest at my table. Eat and drink with me today also, and forgive a cheerful old man for sitting down at table with you." "A cheerful old man," answered the prophet, shaking his head. "But whoever you are, or want to be, O Zarathustra, you have little time left up here to be it. In a little time your boat shall no longer sit in the dry." "Am I then sitting in the dry?" asked Zarathustra, laughing. "The waves around your mountain rise and rise," answered the prophet, "waves of great distress and affliction. Soon they will lift your boat too and carry you away." Thereupon Zarathustra was silent and wondered. "Do you still hear nothing?" the prophet went on. "Does not the sound of rushing and roaring arise from the depths?" Zarathustra was again silent and listened. Then he heard a long protracted cry, which the abysses threw from one to another, for none of them wanted to retain it. So evil did it sound. "You preacher of evil," said Zarathustra at last, "that is a cry of distress, and a human cry. Perhaps it comes from out of a black sea. But what is human distress to me? The ultimate sin that is reserved for me, perhaps you know what it is called." "Pity," answered the prophet from an overflowing heart, and raised both hands aloft. "O Zarathustra, I come to seduce you to your ultimate sin." And hardly were these words spoken than the cry rang out again, and more protracted and more distressed than before, and much nearer. "Do you hear, O Zarathustra?" cried the prophet. "The cry is meant for you. It calls to you. Come, come, come. It is time. It is high time." Hereupon Zarathustra was silent, confused, and deeply shaken. At last he asked, like one undecided, "And who is it that calls me?" "But you know who it is," answered the prophet vehemently. "Why do you hide yourself? It is the higher man that cries for you." So then, the cry of distress. The previous section, we had the honey offering with a nice lovely discussion in the previous episode of the whole enticement of the honey offering, to say, well, it's like a good piece of fishing bait was the metaphor, where you want to have the best bait possible in order to catch the best fish. And of course, what Zarathustra was wanting was not, of course, fish, but, as he said, human fish. And so there's that whole lovely relation into how exactly are you going to set up the best bait possible to therefore entice people into wanting to latch onto it and therefore be seduced by it. And in this section then, we continue on with Zarathustra being in his cave, surrounded by his animals as he is. And then he has this conversation with another prophet. And so the other prophet is going to be one that says here, "It is all one, nothing is worthwhile, the world is without meaning, knowledge chokes." It's a fantastic line. And what does the other prophet really represent is that traditional philosophy move, where you have that move where somebody wants to gain wisdom or knowledge about something, and then you go read a piece of philosophy, and then quite interestingly, what will happen, at least when you read any traditional philosophy like Plato, is that the more that you read, the more that everything in the world is made to be meaningless, and everything that has meaning and value and everything that's worthwhile is precisely everything that's metaphysical. And so you have that great emphasis upon metaphysics, the soul, and the afterlife, and so forth, like you get in Plato. And so suddenly then everything in the world becomes less meaningful, nothing's worthwhile, basic scientific knowledge will only get you so far, and so on. It goes back into that whole part. Nothing is worthwhile, the world is without meaning, knowledge chokes. Because what is the thing that will give you all the value, give you all the meaning, will be that philosopher who'll then try to be like that honey offering, wanting to entice you in like some good human fish. Oh, this is going to be really good for you, if only you'll just take the bait. And then we have, moving on from that, starting to be building up this conversation between Zarathustra and the prophet, where we've had Zarathustra wanting to sit patiently there and just wait for people to be enticed by what he's had to say to come to him, whilst then the prophet's then saying to Zarathustra, you can't just sit around. In fact, your boat is no longer going to be just sitting in the dry anymore, because there's going to be waves that's going to lift it up and move it back out to sea. And so we have then that metaphor again of the sea representing the world, and where Zarathustra would just like to stay up in his mountain, he can't do so because something's going to have to entice him down. And what exactly is that thing that's going to cry for distress is the higher man. And so the higher man's going to be something that's going to force Zarathustra down to go and look for the higher man, to go and offer assistance. But before that as well, we have just this little piece on Nietzsche criticizing the idea of pity. What is human distress to me, the ultimate sin that is reserved for me. Perhaps you know what is called pity. Initially, you would think pity is actually a really good thing because it enables us to be compassionate and have empathy towards another person. And therefore, if you have empathy and compassion, you're able to think in a very moral way, and therefore you're able to put yourself in someone else's shoes. And from all that, you can say, well, then I can act better and give better care to this person, or know how I could help that person who's potentially needing it. But I did actually manage to find a nice slide from Nama Hill, who's a teacher at Thurston Community College, that deals with Nietzsche, his idea of pity, and its relation specifically to Fight Club. And so we only really need to just deal with the first sort of little part of the movie to give context. And this is where Edward Norton's character, who plays the main protagonist in the story, is lying about having specific health conditions in order to then join counseling groups. And the reason that he does this is in order to receive emotional support from those people in the groups, because he's not receiving any form of emotional support in his life whatsoever. But he finds all that comfort in having somebody else there to be there for him. And so we have this nice slide here from Nama that says, whilst crying on Bob, a man with testicular cancer, the narrator, who's Edward Norton's character, assures himself, I found freedom, losing all hope was freedom. Some people would applaud Bob for giving the weak a shoulder to cry on and showing them compassion, but how would Nietzsche view this? It's obviously a key question we want to get to as well. And that is, pity not only robs the narrator of his power, but it becomes infectious and makes you weak. He does nothing to solve his problems, and the film seems to be saying that this is a central problem in our society. So that's the key part as well of the whole crux for this specific part on Nietzsche's view on pity, that you don't actually focus on the specific cause. You're only dealing with the symptoms, is another way of putting it. That what somebody will be doing is just receiving all that emotional support, but not really getting to the core of what their problems really are. And that is within, of course, Edward Norton's life. What exactly is the factors that's pushing him to need that emotional support in the first place? What's the things within his life that's making him to have the need to lie, to join these groups and so forth? And one of the whole things about the movie is quite Nietzschean in a way, because it's moving from this sort of weakened state to a more, let's say, state of becoming more self-assertive, more overman-like, gaining control back of your life. So we can therefore say the key thing about the whole view of pity is that whole relation, therefore, into making someone weaker through not dealing with the actual core problems in their life and only dealing with those symptoms. So that's what Nietzsche would want, is therefore that dealing with the actual problems and overcoming it. So let's continue on then. The higher man, cried Zarathustra, horror-struck. What does he want? What does he want? The higher man. What does he want here? And his skin was covered with sweat. The prophet, however, did not respond to Zarathustra's anguish, but listened intently towards the depths. But when it had remained quiet there for a long time, he had turned his gaze back and saw Zarathustra standing and trembling. "O Zarathustra," he began in a scornful voice, "you do not stand there like one made giddy by happiness. You will have to dance if you are not to fall over. But even if you were to dance before me and indulge in all your tricks, no one could say, 'Behold, here dances the last happy man.' Anyone who sought him here would visit these heights in vain. He would find caves, certainly, and backwood caves, hiding places for the hidden, but not mines of happiness, and treasure houses, and new gold veins of happiness. Happiness? How could man find happiness with such buried men and hermits? Must I yet seek ultimate happiness upon blissful islands and far away among forgotten seas? But it is all one, nothing is worthwhile, seeking is useless, and there are no blissful islands any more." Thus sighed the prophet with his last sigh. However, Zarathustra again became cheerful and assured, like one emerging from a deep chasm into the light. "No, no, thrice no," he cried vigorously and stroked his beard. "I know better. There are still blissful islands. Do not talk about such things, you sighing sackcloth. Cease to splash about such things, you morning rain cloud. Do I not stand here, already wet with your affliction and drenched as a dog? Now I shall shake myself and run away from you, so that I may become dry again. You must not be surprised at that. Do you think me discourteous? But this is my court. But concerning your higher man, very well, I shall seek him at once in those forests. His cry came from there. Perhaps he is being attacked by an evil beast. He is in my domain. Here he shall not come to harm, and truly there are many evil beasts about me." With these words Zarathustra turned to go. Then the prophet said, "O Zarathustra, you are a rogue. I know it. You want to be rid of me. You would rather run into the forests and waylay evil beasts. But what good will it do you? In the evening you will have me back. I shall sit in your own cave, patient and heavy as a log, and wait for you." "So be it," Zarathustra shouted behind him as he departed, "and whatever in my cave belongs to me also belongs to you, my guest. But should you discover honey in there, very well, just lick it up, you growling bear, and sweeten your soul, for in the evening we both must be in good spirits. In good spirits and glad that this day has ended, and you yourself shall dance to my songs as my dancing bear. You do not believe it, you are shaking your head. Very well, go on, old bear. But I too am prophet." Thus spoke Zarathustra. So then we have the higher man and Zarathustra being horror-struck by the mention of this name. And it's quite interesting here because this is the first time that we've ever sort of seen Zarathustra within the whole book ever being sort of taken aback by something. He's always normally pretty proactive as a character, always having a good conversation with something or always seeking something out. But here he's horror struck. And then from that we have moving into a discussion of happiness, with the prophet saying, if you were to go and seek the higher man in Zarathustra's caves, you couldn't find him. And if you were trying to look for happiness, you couldn't find it either. There is no such thing as blissful islands anymore. So we can also relate the character here of the prophet to just a general idea of nihilism, where nihilism is the complete rejection of any sort of meaning or value And this is normally attributed to just the rejection of all sort of religious and moral principles, and to conclude that life is meaningless. And we get this idea of nihilism really coming forth here because there is no value or meaning at all that the prophet has. And one of the key things that comes out of that is the whole line of seeking is useless, because to deny searching is to ultimately deny the whole process of needing to find new things or having the whole aspect of discovery. And to say that is completely pointless and nothing is worthwhile, everything is completely meaningless, including the search itself to discover things, then you lead straight into that whole aspect of nihilism where there is no meaning whatsoever to be found. So we have all this nihilistic viewpoint that the prophet has. Nothing is worthwhile, there is no meaning, there is no value. And then Zarathustra comes around and says the complete opposite of that. No, no, thrice no. I know better. There are still blissful islands. Do not talk about such things, you sighing sackcloth. And then we have Nietzsche's view come in contrast to this nihilism, where he says, well, there is a purpose, because suddenly we do have a meaning to go and search for things, find meaning and find value. There are still these blissful islands, these places of happiness. And then it's just left like that, of course. Nothing's more said about it. And then it just goes into, I'm going to go find the higher man, Zarathustra saying. Make sure he comes to no harm because he's within my domain. But it is interesting just to reflect upon that moment where Zarathustra is arguing for something. There is meaning to go and be found. And what is interesting is the fact that Nietzsche doesn't tell you what to go and look for. Because traditionally, you'll have that. You'll have philosophers very much saying, okay, we're going to identify this list of stuff, and within this list we can see there's a number of things that we want to avoid, and there's a number of things that we want to say are great for us to do. So it's easy as, if you want to have a good life, then you've got to go and follow this stuff and avoid this other stuff, and all be nicely argued for. Here we have Nietzsche's point that's only within a little tiny paragraph, and it doesn't argue for you to do any specific thing. It's only making the point is that there is purpose and there is value. But I'm not going to tell you what that is. But he has given hints at what that is previously. So what is the things that we can start to move towards that gives life purpose and a meaning? Is the move within someone's own life to find that drive and purpose. Another is that move away from that traditional focus in philosophy, away from metaphysics, because that devoids their actions in the here and now of having great value and meaning, because it's all focused upon an afterlife. And so what Nietzsche wants us to do is have all the focus upon here and now through all our actions having as much effect as possible in here and now. Another is through that immense emphasis upon creativity as well. And this is not just in the sense of being artistic, because we always tend to put creativity within, let's say, specific bubbles of doing things, but it's in a much more just general sense. You just say through just the mere process of creating whatever it is, that allows us to have great purpose and meaning to what we do. Because as a human species, what do we like to do? We like to be creators, not just in the literal sense of having children, but also in the sense of producing ideas and creating various different things in the world. And within all that, that gives us purpose and meaning. And then rounding off, we have quite nicely just Zarathustra saying to the prophet, "Oh, just have a bit of my honey that I've been using as the bait. It'll sweeten you up, basically, and it'll not make you as miserable for when I come back to the cave." So overall, the general theme for this section, we can take out of it a criticism of nihilism, and through Zarathustra saying we have purpose to our life. And then also we can say through all that, there's a really nice connection into mental health within all this as well at the same time. Because one of the main things that we can say about mental health wise and psychology wise about this section is its nice relation therefore into depression, because depression is that whole loss of meaning and value and purpose. Then Zarathustra quite nicely give people an enticement, the honey offering, as you would like to say in the last section, of trying to get out of this state and moving towards this sense of purpose again, and meaning and value again. Moving on to the next section then. Conversation with the Kings. Section 1. Zarathustra had not been going an hour through his mountains and forests when all at once he saw a strange procession. Along just that path that he was going down came 2 kings, adorned with crowns and purple sashes and bright as flamingos. They drove before them a laden ass. "What do these kings want in my kingdom?" said Zarathustra in astonishment to his heart, and quickly concealed himself behind a bush. But as the kings drew abreast of him, he said, half aloud, like someone talking to himself, "Strange, strange, I cannot make this out. I see 2 kings and only 1 ass." Then the 2 kings halted, smiled, gazed at the place from which the voice had come, and then looked one another in the face. "No doubt people think such things as that at home, too," said the king on the right, "but they do not utter them." The king on the left shrugged his shoulders and answered, "It's probably a goat herd or a hermit who has lived too long among trees and rocks. For no company at all also corrupts good manners." "Good manners," replied the other king indignantly and bitterly. "What is it we are avoiding then? Is it not good manners, our good company? Truly, better to live among hermits and goat herds than with our gilded, false, painted rabble, although it calls itself nobility. But there, everything is false and rotten, most of all the blood, thanks to all the evil diseases and worse quacks. I think the finest and dearest man today is a healthy peasant, uncouth, cunning, obstinate, endearing. That is the noblest type today. The peasant is the finest man today, and the peasantry should be master. But ours is the kingdom of the rabble. I no longer let myself be taken in. Rabble, however, means hodgepodge. Rabble hodgepodge, and that everything is mixed up with everything else. Saint and scoundrel and gentleman and Jew and every beast out of Noah's Ark. Good manners. Everything is false and rotten with us. Nobody knows how to be respectful any more. It's from precisely this that we are running away. They are honey-mouthed, importunate dogs. They gild palm leaves. It is this disgust that chokes me, that we kings ourselves have become false, arid, and disguised in the old yellowed pomp of our grandfathers, showpieces for the stupidest and the craftiest, and whoever today traffics with power. We are not the first of them, yet we have to pretend to be. We have at last become tired and disgusted with this deception. Now we are avoiding the mob, all these ranters in scribbling blue bottles, the stench of shopkeepers, the struggles of ambition, the foul breath. Faugh to live among the mob. Faugh to pretend to be the first among the mob. Ah, disgust, disgust, disgust. What do we kings matter any more? Your old illness is assailing you, the king on the left said at this point. Disgust is assailing you, my brother, but you know that someone can overhear us. And so, kicking off this section, we have Zarathustra hiding whilst two kings are having a conversation with each other. And the kings talk about nobility and how nobility has become basically a sham, where everything is false, gilded, and everyone in the court is just solely just a painted rabble. And then we also get that in the lines that occur a little bit later. We kings ourselves have become false, arrayed and disguised in the old yellowed pomp of our grandfathers, showpieces for the stupidest and the craftiest, and whoever today traffics with power. We are not the first of them, yet we pretend to be. We have at last become tired and disgusted with this deception. And so we have this whole relation into acting that's going on, and not really actually showing who you truly are or meaning what you truly say. Everything is just solely a performance. Or another good example is that you would only ever tell someone what they wanted to hear and not the actual truth, which might hurt them but would actually be possibly beneficial for them in some way. So everything is just based on this false pretense, and everyone just goes around in this whole actor-like persona, not really being themselves, but rather just performing who they are. And we have that quite nicely fit into Machiavelli here, where Machiavelli and his philosophy, part of it, and the whole idea of Machiavellianism is precisely those points. Never to show who you truly are, but rather only what people want to see. Only just how they want to see you. That's all what you should give someone. And then what you can do, as long as that image is absolutely fine, you can do all sorts of dirty political tactics behind doors and you'll get away with it, basically. So Machiavelli, you could say, in the political philosophy sphere, was one of those people who argued that within a modern context, as long as your public relations is fantastic, you've got absolutely nothing to worry about, because the public will see you in a very specific way that'll be portrayed by the media as an absolutely upstanding person for the public, does all these wonderful, fantastic things. But behind closed doors, what did they get up to then? And we have that with politicians, of course, is that the media will then also expose those things that were happening behind closed doors, and then that affects the whole public image of, oh my God, this person was such a great, upstanding person. How could they do that? So in this way, Nietzsche's also using this as an example within what the kings are discussing within this fictional example of their court. No one's actually being who they actually are or saying what they mean. everything's under false pretenses all the time. And we have that with that such fantastic example that's given as well as in its relation to the prestige of the nobility that's there is completely false, because all what's given there is the pomp and the grandeur which is meant to give it meaning and value because of its historical significance. But as the kings say, they're not their grandfather. What does that mean? In the past context, of course, they would have had a semblance of power and control and so forth over the population. So Nietzsche must be thinking about traditional monarchical system here. Then they've lost that power. It might have moved therefore into constitutional monarchy. And so therefore all what they do is pretend to be in the roles, but they're not their grandfathers and so forth before them, because they have absolutely no resemblance of the same power or control that they do. All what they are is just a good public image there, or is a nice good tourist attraction for other people to come in to the country and just to go and view the history of it all. And at the same time we have this discussion about peasants and the rabble and herd mentalities. Nietzsche's concept creep back up again. But let's continue on, because as what he's going to say in the next little bit will nicely tie in to what's been previously said. Hereupon Zarathustra, who had kept his ears and eyes open to these speeches, rose from his hiding place, stepped towards the kings, and began, "He who has overheard you, he who likes to overhear you, O kings, is called Zarathustra. I am Zarathustra, who once said, 'What do kings matter any more?' But I was glad when you said to one another, 'What do we kings matter?' This, however, is my kingdom and dominion. What might you be seeking in my kingdom? But perhaps on your way you have found what I am seeking. That is the higher man." When the kings heard this, they beat their breasts and said in a single voice, "We have been recognized." With the sword of these words, you have cut through the thickest darkness of our hearts. You have discovered our distress, for behold, we are on our way to find the higher man, the man who is higher than we. Although we are kings, we are leading this ass to him, for the highest man shall also be the highest lord on earth. There is no harder misfortune in all human destiny than when the powerful of the earth are not also the first men. Then everything becomes false and awry and monstrous. And when even the last men and more beast than men, then the value of the rabble rises higher and higher, and at last the rabble virtue says, "Behold, I alone am virtue." "What do I hear?" answered Zarathustra. "What wisdom from kings? I am enchanted, and truly, I already feel the urge to compose a verse about it. Even if it should be a verse not suited to everyone's ears, I long ago unlearned consideration for long ears. Very well, come on." But here it happened that the ass too found speech. It said clearly and maliciously, "Yaw. Once upon a time, 'twas A.D. 1, I think. Thus spoke the Sibyl, drunken without drink. How bad things go! Decay, decay, ne'er sank the world so low. Rome is now a harlot, and a brothel too. Rome's Caesar a beast, and God himself a Jew." And so, kicking off this section then, we have that line, "What do kings matter now?" And Zarathustra replying back to say, "Well, that's also what I said." And so we can go back into this discussion of herd mentality that's going on here. Because we can say, well, with the nobility, what's given is a virtue is basically then a falsity that's upheld, some sort of ideality that how everyone should like to live, but not how everyone actually lives, and everything's based upon that false pretense. And then with herd mentality, we have basically not this ideal is presented to us for how we should live, but rather, as Nietzsche says, this beast-like quality that's privileged in humanity that is then presented as something that's virtuous for everybody to go and aspire towards. And let's just say, based upon our immediate instinctual drives, for instance, all that emphasis upon consumerism and consumer society would be all things that would emerge out of that emphasis upon the herd and herd-like mentality because of that need to consume. And also that mob rule and mob mentality would also sort of come out of that, of what a justice style system could potentially look like if it was solely based upon that. So it's quite interesting when we look at this politically, because Nietzsche is being critical of nobility here and within that court system, and is also being critical of a democratic system at the same time. So really, what is the things that Nietzsche would want to move towards, at least in the political sense? And you get that more towards the little end section of section 1 here, where you would have that relation back into great leaders within history. Very much Nietzsche likes the idea of Julius Caesar there that we have, and precisely the ideas that's also been touched upon in previous episodes of great civilizations within history like Rome as well. It seems to be creeping up a little bit every now and then as an idea of something that Nietzsche likes. Why is that the given case? Is because that it doesn't move in towards this idea of herd mentality, but you are precisely trying to establish a way in which everybody can then flourish within that given society. And through great leaders, he sees, really like Caesar there, as in a good example in which people were able to come out of a situation in a much stronger way, arguably, than through the previous ways. Of course, I'm just talking about this in a very general sense. So let's break down this last little part here for section 1, in which we have mention of the Sibyl here, the Sibyl drunken without drink. And the Sibyl, to touch upon a little bit of classical history, is the prophet of Apollo. And so Apollo is the god of reason and music and healing. And suddenly then we have this relation into being drunk all of a sudden. And the Sibyl is quite a significant character as well, because people used to go and ask for their future and visit the Sibyl, and therefore would receive an answer that was in the form of a riddle that you would have to try and work out what it meant. And that would be in relation to someone's future. And then we have the relation back into Rome being like a harlot in a brothel. Caesar is a beast. And then lastly it says God himself a Jew. Now it's crucial to say at this given point as well, Nietzsche's not being anti-Semitic. In fact, Nietzsche himself wasn't anti-Semitic whatsoever. An example of that is where he gets into a heated argument with his sister, who is an anti-Semite. So overall, what exactly is this section saying? And one of the things we can get out of it is, if we just look at each given example, for the Sibyl, a character who is held in high regard by that society of the given time period is now a drunkard. Rome is destitute, is no longer some place that is what it once was. Then Caesar is now a beast, no longer a grand leader. And then if you take the power of God and make it human, each given instance in there, we're taking something grand and then we're putting it down every given time. And so the grandeur's lost in a given way every time. And it's also quite crucial here to just mention that why would this God in relation into Christ come out here? Because, and also quite confusingly, when you deal with the whole relation of God is literally being Christ, it would surely be a mistake. So I'm not 100% sure if it's a mistake of the translation or just what exactly is going on with this given little section here, because not even within the Bible and Christianity do you have Christ as literally being God. Rather, you have Christ as a representative of God. So the prophet in a given way, and the messenger of God, rather than literally the embodiment of God. So that line itself is quite confusing. So from all this, it nicely fits back into the previous section, the cry of distress, because we have that nice relation back into the prophet where nothing is worthwhile anymore, everything is completely meaningless. And in this given context is everything that was upheld as grand is suddenly then decayed. And of course, in a given context, that happens with knowledge itself, of course. Something that's held up as an idea over time, as he said in previous episodes, decays. But at the same time as this, we're still saying that there is blissful islands, there is something to be worthwhile to go and look for. There is worth something to go and seek. And in this given context, it's the higher man to go and look for. And that's what the kings have went to go and seek. So moving on to section 2 then. The kings were delighted with the lines of Zarathustra's, and the king on the right said, "O Zarathustra, how well we did to come out and see you. For your enemies have shown us your image in their mirror, from which you gazed with the grimace of a devil, and with mocking laughter, so that we were afraid of you. But what good was it? Again and again you stung our hearts and ears with your sayings. Then at last we said, what does it matter how he looks? We must hear him who teaches you should love peace as a means to new wars, and a short peace more than a long. No one ever spoke such warlike words. What is good? To be brave is good. It is the good war that hallows every cause. O Zarathustra, at such words the blood of our fathers stirred in our bodies. It was like spring speaking to old wine casks. Our fathers loved life when swords were crossed like red-flecked serpents. They thought all sons of peace faint and feeble, but the long peace made them ashamed. How they sighed, our fathers, when they saw resplendent parched swords upon the wall. Like them they thirst for war, for a sword wants to drink blood and sparkles with its desire. As the kings thus eagerly talked and babbled of the happiness of their fathers, Zarathustra was overcome by no small desire to mock their eagerness, for they were apparently very peaceable kings that he saw before himself with aged, refined faces. But he controlled himself. Very well, he said, yonder leads the way to Zarathustra's cave, and this day shall have a long evening. But now a cry of distress calls me hurriedly away from you. My cave will be honoured if kings would sit and wait in it. But to be sure, you will have to wait a long time. But really, what does it matter? Where today does one learn to wait better than in courts? And the whole virtue still remaining to kings, is it not today called being able to wait? Thus spoke Zarathustra. So for section 2 then, we have that nice initial point that the kings were apprehensive about wanting to go and visit Zarathustra. So we have that nice brief relation into how a given person can be portrayed by the media or scapegoated into being perceived a given way, when in fact what they could be saying and thinking is something completely the opposite of that. And a great example of that is when the media tried to blame Marilyn Manson for the Columbine shootings, and there was that whole trying to pin the blame specifically on him and his music, when of course there's no correlation between both whatsoever. And you tend to find that repeats itself, where there's this continual need to scapegoat something, and quite frequently it can be video games as well, as the cause or reason for why this person did this given action. And of course it's all normally complete rubbish, and it's all just completely hot air, because there's no clear correlation in every given instance that's usually portrayed that there is that connection between both things. And then we have this discussion of war, and then suddenly the kings, who are meant to be quite peaceful, suddenly reminisce about the past and how much beneficial a warlike conflict would be and so forth. And quite interestingly, given the fact we've just had that reminiscing of the past in the previous section about Rome, about Caesar, about the Sibyl, you would suddenly be like, well, maybe Zarathustra, representing Nietzsche here, would suddenly be like, well, that's maybe a good thing to reminisce about the past, because suddenly we have these past things and ideals that are possibly begun to be upheld here. But no, in fact, Zarathustra wants to be mocking of them. And that's really interesting, because you just suddenly think, oh, this argument's going down one road, and then just suddenly it takes that sharp left turn and goes in the opposite direction on you. So we can say then, what have we always got to be wary of? Trying to think and pigeonhole a specific idea going down a specific route, and where you start to think about a person in a specific way, which is fantastic in this given instance, because it tricks you, it suckers you in a given way, where you're thinking this is going to be arguing for a certain viewpoint and arguing about the grandeurs of the good old days and wants to go back to that. But then suddenly Zarathustra wants to mock them. And so we then have, really, through this mocking and the importance of that, to say, well, those that reminisce on the past are worth mocking. What does that mean in a deeper context? Is that they're so much focused upon the past that they're not actually dealing with the problems in the present. And that's one of the things that you get out of this section, is where you can have all that within the past, have all these grand ideas, they do decay, and there's going to be those people that want to go back to those ideas and the past ideas and so forth. But that's the point that Nietzsche wants to make here, is that you can't, at least not in the same way, and you have to deal with the modern problems. And the modern problems is that of the herd mentality, as he says here. And these specific ideas that's all emerging out of the problems with that. And then that quite nice fits into that point about being able to wait. If only you could just wait, it would come back. Just like fashion, they always say. If you only just wait long enough, the fashion will come back and you'll be back in trend. It's almost like that given point is mocking there to say, well, it can never come back. At least not in the way that it previously was. Now, that is what's so good about the way in which things do return. It's always differently. And the nice ways in which we can see within contemporary society, at least, the ways that we nicely blend old stuff, spicing it up a bit, and vamping it up is a good word. Refreshing it in some given way, and then that changes it. But also, from this whole warlike mentality out of this, we can go back into the previous whole ideas that we've had within that section of the warriors and the soldiers. Way back in part 1, when it was of war and warriors, and that section was arguing that there's a great amount of soldiers, but there's not enough warriors. And this is where the problems that the kings have gotten into at this given point as well, that they want to be warriors, but they're ultimately soldiers. What's the difference here? Is that soldiers are people who are going to go and try and just upheld a given viewpoint and be soldier for that given point or view. So we have that within organized religions, of course. We have specifically the ideology of whatever religion it is. Then we have all the soldiers to back up that ideology. Then with the warriors, what is the difference then? Is that it's those people who are able to critically engage and have that rebuttal against the ideology or the ideas. And so it's not just simply taking everything at face value, but rather starting to move towards those whole points of starting to think for yourself. So being warlike in your mentality is to therefore start to adopt the whole process of critical thinking. And so it's that whole point about adopting a more critical perspective about things. And so that about wraps up another episode. So what's one of the main things that we can take away from these two sections is that we've had this lovely discussion about nihilism, and suddenly everything having no value and everything having no meaning whatsoever. Zarathustra's view being in contrast to this, there is something that we should go and seek. And what exactly is that thing that we should go and seek? It's the higher man. And what does this tend to reflect is when we have that crisis of meaning, what do people want to go and discover is a sense of purpose that will give their life meaning in some given way. And so the higher man itself is functioning in a religious sort of way within these sections. However, it is twisting the idea at the same time, because for Nietzsche, we never want to go towards the ideas of the soul or the afterlife, but rather what is the things that's being focused upon here? What is the things that's going to be giving our life meaning and purpose and have value again? Is those points made towards the end of the first discussion as being more creative individuals, creating our ideas, seeing our ideas come to fruition, having the move into the here and now rather than on the afterlife, gives all our purpose and meaning to our actions in the world. And at the end of section 2, we can say, well, what's a couple of the problems that we have identified whenever that somebody does try to go towards another idea is that we've then had the pitfalls of trying to uphold past ideas because they decay over time. We have those people that try and reminisce about the past and want to uphold those ideas when they don't focus upon the need to address contemporary and modern problems. And then we also have that problem of falsity within contemporary society in that modern context. At the same time, everybody's acting under that false pretense, not really being who they are. And so we have that wonderful whole sense of having that need to sort of create who you are out with this whole context of needing to act and perform for other people. And that whole idea of needing to create ourselves that's popped up in previous episodes, as well as a continual reoccurring theme within Zarathustra. In the next episode, we'll be continuing our journey through part 4 of Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra into the section entitled The Leech. Many thanks for listening to the episode. I hope you enjoyed my discussion of the sections The Cry of Distress and Conversation with the Kings in Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Feel free to check out my Patreon page at patreon.com/dissecting philosophy. Feel free to tip me a coffee at ko-fi.com/dissecting philosophy. Drop me an email at my address dissectingphilosophy@gmail.com. And lastly, I can be found on Twitter at @IamARubberman. Many thanks for listening, and I'll hope you'll join me next time.